Hi, everybody. So today I want to talk about how a right brain weakness and also a left brain overdevelopment, what that looks like. I talked about that last week, but particularly how it affects academics. And I really want to talk about this because these kids are typically really smart, often above average IQ, but it can be really frustrating when they start having academic difficulties because of this right brain weakness, which isn't actually tied usually to IQ, but something different. And so once you kind of get to the root of this and understand what's really going on, and even how sometimes these kids are misdiagnosed, then everything can really start to make a lot more sense, and then you can really start to take action. So, because we know this is super frustrating for both parents and kids when this happens. These kids, like I said, are smart, and oftentimes they know they're smart. I remember teaching these kids, but they're having that academic slide sometimes as they get older, and it's really frustrating for them because sometimes they know they're just as smart, if not smarter than their peers. And so when they start struggling in school, it can be really discouraging. It can cause them to shut down and result in those behavior issues and so forth that I talked about last week. So let's just recap and go in a little bit more depth about the left brain, which tends to be overdeveloped in kids with ADHD, autism spectrum, ODD is another example, OCD, and so forth. So the left side of the brain is responsible for those fine motor skills. Right brain is gross motor skills. So these are the kids who they might be really adept at playing a musical instrument because they have these really good, finely tuned fine motor skills. And then the left brain also, as I talked about last week, is, where the language center is. These are the kids who might have hyperlexia. They learn to read early, because that side of the brain is responsible for decoding and blending sounds and all of that stuff required for learning and reading. And so the other thing is the left brain, as many of us know, is very logic based. So it's responsible for sequences and patterns. It's very curious. It's very scientific. A lot of these kids do well in math and the sciences. They can literally be, mathematical or scientific geniuses. I remember one year I taught a kid who had autism spectrum, was then, called Asperger's, but anyway, and he really struggled socially, had a hard time making eye contact, making conversation, all of that type of stuff. But he literally was a mathematical genius and was like in grade 7 taking grade 9 or 10 math. And that's that left brain overdevelopment. So as many of us know, these kids are, the left brain loves routine. And this is why we see with autistic kids, and even other kids with SPD and all that type of stuff, they have a really hard time with transitions, right? Right brain is spontaneous, left brain loves routine. And so when we balance that out, that's where we see these kids being able to process and handle transitions better. But that's also where we get that hyper focus from with ADHD kids, is because the left brain is more obsessive. And so we need that right brain to balance it out. If that right brain is underdeveloped, like it is with these kids, then that obsessiveness can, turn into this hyper focus or possibly OCD and so forth. The other aspect with the left brain, both the left and right brain are used for language. However, the right brain is all about body language, detecting tone of voice. It thinks in symbols. It's more abstract. So it picks up on all those subtle cues related to language, whereas the left side of the brain is literal. And so this is where, again, with our kids who are on the spectrum, or kids who, I even see this with ADHD kids, they will have a harder time reading facial expressions or picking up on those subtle cues, that most of us, will. Sometimes people will be kind of cruel and say they have no social awareness and so forth. They might even have a harder time detecting sarcasm or expressions. So, for example, if you say to, a child, I don't know, who's autistic, don't count your chickens before they're hatched. They don't necessarily understand these abstract expressions, and they're taking you literally, right? Like not to count chickens before they're hatched. Or I remember whenever I was, totally naive, really didn't have proper training, and was in my first year teaching, I was working with an autistic child, and he was actually 12 or 13. And we were just joking around, we were having a great time, and I said something kind of sarcastically, not mean or anything, but he kind of just looked at me like he didn't get it. And it was only later on that I learned, right, that these kids have a harder time understanding sarcasm. And so he actually thought it was serious. And so you do want to be careful with that though, because we can definitely come across as insensitive or hurt their feelings if someone doesn't understand sarcasm. So as I mentioned, left brain is all about patterns. That's part of language. It's part of reading. It's also part of music, right? Whether it's listening to music, playing music, all that type of stuff, as well as video games. So this is why these kids tend to be really good at music, can be actually quite talented. And also why they really love video games, because it's all about patterns and sequences. However, this is where we have to be careful, because as much as it can be like, oh, such a breath of fresh air to just let them play their video games for how many hours and get them out of our hair, if that's done on a consistent basis, the problem with video gaming is that it actually further develops that left brain. So we're further contributing to that imbalance whenever you have kids who are playing video games 8 hours a day. So, what I want to jump into though is the gifts of the left brain, which I've started talking about a bit, but things that we notice and see with these kids who have left brain overdevelopment, typically in ADHD and ASD kids. So number one, we know they're smart. Left brain is all about IQ, right? Right brain is EQ, emotional intelligence. These kids not only are good at math and science typically and all that other stuff, they can be really good at not just reading, like that hyperlexia, but also with languages, like learning languages, because language center, left side of the brain, right? And so, like I said, because the auditory cortex is on the left side of the brain, this is where these kids will be really good at music and will, basically, again, can be geniuses, because that side is like more than developed, it's overdeveloped. But what I really want to talk about is learning difficulties and how this imbalance can affect these kids in ways that are not so good in school and in life. So for some kids, this imbalance can look like a learning disability, and sometimes it could be, but sometimes it can look like a learning disability when it's not, because a child has a hard time focusing, or because they're overwhelmed with sensory information, or, like in the classroom and so forth, like sensory stimuli, and they just can't focus. And so what happens is they end up with learning gaps because they're so overwhelmed, or they, can't focus on what they need to do and to learn, even though, in terms of IQ, they're quite capable of doing it, but the poor focus is causing the gaps. So kids with basically ASD, SPD, all of that type of stuff, too overwhelmed, learning gaps. The other thing that happens is sometimes it can look like a reading difficulty or disorder, and truly it can be, right? But it might be, it's typically different than your run-of-the-mill dyslexia. So let me first just define dyslexia. And I say that because, in my province, we haven't seen dyslexia on an IEP in forever. They don't call it that anymore. Or not really. They call it a language-based learning disability. And depending on province, state, and so forth, or country, basically diagnosing categories and different types of reading disabilities is described differently. But dyslexia is typically described as a phonological deficit. So that means a kid has a hard time breaking sounds into their smallest sound units, detecting them, blending them, all of that type of stuff. Unfortunately, many of us think that dyslexia is when a kid or child reads and writes letters backwards. Absolutely not true. Totally biggest frustrating myth. So what happens, first of all, is that a child with a left brain overdevelopment, right brain weakness can sometimes have difficulty focusing long enough to learn the sounds of letters, to learn how to, read and blend and all of that type of stuff that is necessary, because their poor focus is making it hard to do that. And it can look like they just can't learn to read. The other aspect is these kids might have visual processing disorder, which is a type of disorder which can lead to a reading disorder because the letters blur, reverse, move. And that's different than dyslexia, right? Dyslexia is a phonological deficit. A visual processing disorder, sometimes called visual dyslexia, is where the words move, blur, and so forth. And the reason this is more likely in kids with a left brain overdevelopment and a right brain delay is because the visual cortex is on the right side of the brain. So if that side of the brain is underdeveloped, then we're going to obviously have a higher rate of visual processing issues. And this can affect other stuff as well, which I talked about last week, right, with coordination and sports and art and all of that, possibly even handwriting, all that type of stuff. So in a nutshell, brain scans have shown that kids with ADHD and ASD have less electrical activity or connections on the right side of the brain, have way more connections to the point of like above average connectivity on the left side of the brain. And this is what creates that imbalance, and again creates those beautiful areas of genius, but also can really create some serious everyday struggles as a result. And overdevelopment can be a good thing, right? Like it, in certain regards, like being really talented at music. But if we're also having to deal with OCD and difficulty transitioning, and the inability to focus, that overdevelopment is causing a whole lot of areas of impairment. And if we can balance that other side of the brain, stimulate that side of the brain to increase connectivity and so forth, then the side of the brain that should be kind of acting like the brakes a bit more is going to help balance that out. Hi, Cindy. Thanks for jumping in. So the side of the brain that is imbalanced we can develop that connectivity, and then the result can be that these kids are no longer struggling the way they do. They are not going to lose their area of genius. Like I said before, that auditory cortex or whatever it is that they excel in or is really developed is not going anywhere, but it just means they're not going to struggle. And I can attest to this because my daughter had a left brain overdevelopment and a right brain weakness. And so as a result, she had a lot of SPD and OCD and a bit of ODD and ADHD and all that type of stuff. And, but she also is extremely empathic, very, very sensitive to people's feelings, very compassionate, really creative, all kinds of stuff. Those things did not go away. She still has all of those gifts, but life is a heck of a lot easier for her. So, if you want to learn more, want to know how to get started, I will post in the comments below the link to my free starter kit. I've actually updated it, called the Laser Focused Learner, and it actually has exercises to help get your child focused, help get them out of fight or flight, to get them feeling better and so forth, so that they can start learning better. And this is just a tiny snapshot of some of the exercises that you can do, that I do in my 6-month program, the Full Potential Formula, that can help to rewire the brain. So do reach out, book a clarity call if you're interested in knowing more about my 6-month program, the Full Potential Formula, where we basically combine nutrition, gut healing, all of that important biochemical stuff with better brain organization. So exercises that stimulate, the brain to create new neurons, new connections, get better organized and so forth, so that kids can learn, read, focus, and manage their emotions better. And mom can be a whole lot happier and more relaxed. So thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know in the comments below, do you see signs of your child having a left brain overdevelopment and a right brain underdevelopment? Does some of this resonate even with their reading or their, have they slid academically as they go further into school, but that they're bright, they know that they're bright, and there's this really frustrating barricade in the way. So thanks for watching and have a great day.